I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 17.3. India seeks self-rule. You can see the two flags in the imagery there. You see obviously the Indian nationalist flag on the top left and the British flag down the bottom right. And that's what we're basically seeing here is a struggle for the Indian people to obtain independence from Great Britain. Right, some of the objectives we'll be looking at is the impact of World War I and the Amritsar massacre on Indian nationalism. Look at the ideas of Mohandas Gandhi, and we'll analyze how Gandhi led resistance to political oppression in India. So as we go through each question, kind of think about how you might respond down as I read the question, and then see how well that matches up with what I share to you. All right, so when you look at number one, why was the Indian National Congress established, or the INC? So anytime you see a Congress, that's an organization or group who are working collectively together towards common goals. It's established originally in 1885 to fight for Indian self-rule and eventually independence from Great Britain. A lot of the movements that kind of emerged during this period of time for independence in India are from the educated class, those who had attended college, who learned a little bit more about reforms around the world and the opportunities that they should have in their own country. And since they didn't receive them or didn't have them, they felt like they needed to fight for them. Two, why were Indians outraged at the British after World War I? When you think about World War I, that was a collective world effort, and the Indian people, a lot of their soldiers, they agreed to fight with the British with some hope or optimism that after World War I, they would receive their independence. So more than 1 million Indians served overseas fighting for the British in World War I. They were promised additional freedoms and rights after the war with a lot of hope and optimism towards independence, but at the very least, more rights and freedoms within the structure of the British control. That did not occur. The Brits showed little to no respect for Indian rights and customs, and Great Britain continued to operate off the perspective that the Indian colony and any of their colonies were there for their own exploitation and for their own use, and not necessarily any real interest in the individual rights and freedoms of citizens. Three, who emerged in the 1920s as the true spokesperson for the Indian independence movement? Well, this should be a pretty easy question for everyone to answer. That, of course, is Mohandas Gandhi. He was nicknamed Mahatma, or the Great Soul, to kind of put forth the general idea that he was almost the chosen person to kind of lead the Indian people to freedom. Four, what was Gandhi's background? He was born into a middle-class Hindu family in 1869. At age 19, he went to England to study law and lived abroad for about 20 years. So once again, as we had alluded to earlier, a lot of the independence movements coming from the better educated class within India. And of course, Gandhi is a good example of somebody who was very well educated. Not only did he learn and get educated, he also learned firsthand some of the freedoms that people across the world enjoyed and that the Indian people should have. He worked as an attorney in South Africa, where he fought against discrimination there, and then he returned to India in 1914 to fight British occupation. Okay, 5, what type of resistance did Gandhi emphasize in India? Why? Well, knowing the type of person that Gandhi was, he's kind of synonymous with nonviolent peaceful protest. Okay, so nonviolent acts of resistance would be something that he would advocate for himself and also his followers. He believed had he used violence, the British would have responded with additional violence and maybe slaughtered either he and its followers. And I kind of have that little note here. Change would occur through love and peace. Kind of an idealistic goal and belief, but certainly one that he did follow. 6, how was Gandhi treated when he returned to India? Why? When you think about Gandhi returning to India, you're going to have some who are going to love him and some who are not going to be very happy that he's returning. But for the Indian people, he was thought to be a hero. As far as the Brits were concerned, obviously he was seen as a threat to their control in India, so he was to be met with some degree of caution. So you see Sir Sidney Rowlatt there, pictured on the left, the president of the Rowlatt Committee. And he's going to put forth some suggestions here in regard to the governing in India. The Rowlatt Acts allowed the British officials to arrest and imprison any citizen suspected of urging people to disobey the government. So this is kind of a crackdown or a harsh law against the Indian citizens. This act infuriated people and led to additional protests within India. This convinced more Indian people more than ever that they needed to be independent and free from British control. 8, explain the events that occurred on April 13th, 1919 in India. This is one of the more horrific dates in Indian history and even all of world history when you think about the sheer slaughtering and the deaths of innocents. Basically, what the Indian people did is they gathered in some large numbers. So these Rowlatt Acts were being ignored by the Indian people. So kind of almost like a boycott. So you can add a little notation there. Basically, a boycott of Indian rules, maybe not necessarily goods or purchasing something that you normally associate with a traditional boycott. Thousands gathered in the northern Indian city of Amritsar. 379 people were killed. Thousands more were injured in what is remembered as the Amritsar massacre. This is kind of a pivot moment or turning point in anti-British feelings in India. And this could be compared to, from the sad aspect, to the Boston Massacre in the United States during the period of time of British control of the 13 American colonies, or Bloody Sunday, which took place in 1905 in Russia when the Russian guards opened fire on the innocent Russian civilians gathered outside Tsar Nicholas II's palace. Here you can see the British soldiers positioned here and a very large crowd of the Indian protesters, and the Indian soldiers pretty much just opened fire in the crowd, killing nearly 400 people and injuring many thousands more in the crowd here. So, if you got hit, you could probably begin to run. And so maybe there was a lot of injuries from gunfire, and then the fatalities of those, many of whom were towards the front there, who were gunned down and killed. 9, how did the Amritsar massacre impact Gandhi's protest movement? No longer was he calling for self-rule, but began to demand full independence from Great Britain. So initially, prior to the Rowlatt Acts, they were hoping in the service during World War I, they were hoping for a fairer system with the British in control. Now they're hoping for independence. It kind of shifted. 10, what were Gandhi's main beliefs? He believed in hisma, or nonviolence, or civil disobedience. That's what we mentioned earlier. He advocated the use of these to fight for justice and independence. He believed that by using the power of love, people can convert even the worst wrongdoer to make the right decisions. 11, how did Gandhi apply Henry David Thoreau's idea about civil disobedience to India's political situation? Well, Henry David Thoreau is kind of like the original author or champion of nonviolent passive resistance or civil disobedience. Gandhi would be a follower, and later on Martin Luther King. There was an official boycott on British goods, led nonviolent protests to express opposition in a peaceful way. Two key components there: boycott and protesting in a peaceful fashion. Speaking of fashion, how did Gandhi dress? Why? You can see the imagery there. So Gandhi dressed in a very simple Hindu tradition, white garment called the dhoti. He urged others to dress this way because it was made from Indian cotton and wanted to boycott all British goods. 13, why do so many Indians support Gandhi? Well, some of his means of achieving independence were greatly admired. He did things such as fasting, praying, and nonviolent protest, and he gained national support, not only national support, but international support as his actions were being covered across the globe. What was Gandhi's Salt March? Did it achieve its goals? We have some imagery here for us. So Gandhi's Salt March, it was a 240-mile march to the sea to protest British salt monopolies and the government's laws that Indians could buy salt only from the British monopoly. That's further restricting the Indian economy. It partially achieved its goals because it gained more followers and brought national and international attention to the cause. However, it did not achieve independence. You can see the march imagery on the left, and then the movement of the Salt March over that 240-mile journey, kind of heading southward in India. How did the rest of the world react to the British actions against India? Many nations, including the United States, began to call for Great Britain to leave India. So he's making the case. It's gaining momentum both in India and around the world. 16, what reasons did the British government give for postponing independence during the 1930s? What was the effect of this decision? Well, of course, the Brits are always looking for an excuse to delay. There's no benefit to them by granting the British independence. They want to let that kind of linger as long as possible. So World War II broke out, and as a result, they figured that would be another excuse to delay it again. The Brits needed the Indians too to help them fight, like they did in World War I. And then many nationalists began to launch an offensive to try and facilitate independence. And lastly, the lesson reflection, you can kind of just think about Gandhi here in the context of what we discussed. Why is Gandhi considered one of the most well-respected leaders in world history? Well, of course, he's a courageous leader for Indian independence from Great Britain. He stood up to a much bigger power. He always did it in a nonviolent, passive resistance, peacefully. And eventually helped to gain independence for India in 1947, and others like Martin Luther King and many in the American Civil Rights Movement later on in the 1950s and 60s would follow the model that Gandhi had done in India. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussions here of the Indian independence movement. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.